Hello everyone and welcome to the discussion of the day. Today's topic is going to be the evolution of horror movies, specifically focusing on the growth and impact of three films released by Universal Studios in the monster movie era of Hollywood. The three we will focus on are The Invisible Man from 1933, The Wolf Man from 1941, and The Mummy from 1959. These three films were contributing narratives in the birth of cinematic horror, and have registered with audiences for a very long time. Though they may not have had great budgets or incredible means to execute the film, each film has been regarded as one of the top monster films ever made. The question I intend to answer is this: why are these films successful? Where did they get their concepts? And what about them makes them stand the test of time? Let's dive right in. As is common with many films of the modern day, horror films tend to recycle a lot of tropes and cliches from their predecessors. This is often in the form of an homage or a simple shot type, but can be as blatant as a clear-cut replica of a style. Keeping the three films from Universal in mind, I want to direct our attention to two silent films that I found to be the best representatives of the spine of horror in Hollywood at its earliest form: Edison's Frankenstein from 1910 and F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu from 1922. These two films are the origin of many of the overused tropes and cliches that have carried through to today's cinema. Taking a look at the following clips, we can spot some of the notable shots and traits of monsters and horror films today, such as the hand creeping through a cracked doorway, a door flying open by itself followed by the gliding movement of the creature, the monster being tall, thin, and ominous with elongated fingers, and many more. These traits have been recycled time after time, and for some reason we as an audience never find it to be outrageously bland. It seems to me that the reason these traits have been stuck to the horror genre for so long is because we exaggerate our fears to be these overwhelming and overshadowing demons that are larger and more dangerous than we can ever be, and that comes across in their appearance and ability. The long fingers of Nosferatu and Frankenstein could wrap around our neck with ease, which explains why the same trait was carried over into the 2014 character, the Babadook. Similarly, the elongated posture with an intimidating stance can be clearly noted not only in both characters from the silent era, but also in The Invisible Man, The Mummy, as well as more recent monsters like the Babadook, Slenderman, and Pennywise from Stephen King's It. In fact, King himself wrote, "If we share a brotherhood of man, then we also share an insanity of man." If we do share an insanity of man, then it would be understandable that certain qualities of horror would, like Michael Myers or the High Priest Karis, never die. The combination of daunting posture and horrifying visual qualities, such as Griffith's unbandaged head looking almost skeleton-like, the Wolfman's trippy transformation sequence, and the Mummy standing tall and strong, creeping up to windows and doors, breaking them down, all add to the elements of the films that audiences and myself have come to love and fear all at once. On top of the technical shots that were achieved with these films, a large part of their success was the careful decision to create and release each film in the year they were made. Each of these films were released in a decade where our country was going through a large amount of emotional turmoil, and the specific events in the world at those times have clear contributing factors to the narratives in each film. In the 30s, we were suffering from the Great Depression, and the Invisible Man ran amok in a poverty-stricken town. In the 40s, we were in the midst of World War II, and the Wolfman was a man-turned-monster released into a town to be murderous. And in the late 50s, we were on the brink of the nuclear tensions and Cold War era, and the Mummy was released to generate fear of a foreign enemy. Each of these films reaped success because of the emotions that controlled our country. Citizens were feeling any number of emotions all at once, from anger to sadness, fear, depression, hate, and much more. Universal Studios saw an opportunity and gave audiences a film and a chance each year to flock into the theater and release all of their emotions into a dark and ominous narrative. In a sense, the horror film was a therapeutic experience for many Americans during these times. Not to mention, they were not as complex as an Orson Welles or Hitchcock film may have been. By venting out all of the hateful and painful feelings and thoughts that had been bottled up before the movie, audiences were able to breathe and escape the realities of the surrounding world and exist on a primal level. In the essay, Why We Crave Horror, Stephen King brings up a comment by one critic who suggested that the horror film is the voyeur's equivalent to a public lynching. This comment took me by surprise at first, but after letting it settle, I remembered that this was not outside the realm of possibility for the time or even today. Not only did these horror films allow audiences to vent out their fears, it challenged them to enjoy their most demented and sadistic desires as well. The concept of Schadenfreude, the German term meaning happiness at the misfortune of others, seems to be the motivator for our subconscious to really enjoy films that show such dark and terrifying things. Thinking about today's environment, many of the darker things that we enjoy center around the idea of survival and mankind overcoming and killing our enemies, specifically the enemy of death. This is relevant in shows such as Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead, where our main characters spend the entire series fighting against an undead army with no clear weaknesses. The fight seems almost impossible, and yet for some reason our heroes keep fighting and we keep surviving. This kind of mental reassurance that we can survive and overcome is something that can only come from a horror film, and that is what audiences of the 30s, 40s, and 50s connected to and needed most from The Invisible Man, The Wolfman, and The Mummy. Many filmmaking professors will say that the final story is created in the editing room. And that is consistent all the way from the teens to today's cinema. Editing allows a filmmaker to manipulate and guide their audience to places in the film without ever having to say a word in the process. The beauty of a good edit with good structure is that it can lead us to feeling exactly what the director wants us to feel in a moment times 10. This craft is demonstrated very well in Universal's 3 films, and is a quality that many horror films today lack. YouTuber Chris Stuckmann explains exactly what the issue is in his video, The Problem with Horror Today, and makes a valid argument about something he calls the curse of the jump scare. Let's listen to what he has to say.
If your audience begins to associate everything frightening in the film with loud noises and sound effects, then your film will build to nothing. The climax of the movie won't be effective in the least, because the audience has already had all the tension released too early by countless jump scares, making what's actually supposed to be frightening near the end tiresome.
As you heard, the jump scare manages to remove all tension from a scene, leaving the audience bored and tired by the time the climax actually shows up. This is something that The Invisible Man, The Wolfman, and The Mummy don't include in their editing and structure. In some of the most climactic moments of the 3 films, that being when Griffith removes his bandages for the first time, the Wolfman finally morphs for the first time, and when the Mummy is first seen, all the tension that had been building from the beginning of the film is still there waiting to be released because there's never a moment of a jump scare to deflate the tension. NYU professor Karen Hartsfield would always say that each decision you make in your script should be used to ratchet up the tension so that when you get to your climax, it feels earned. Logically, this makes sense, and is something that Universal actually managed to accomplish very well in their earlier monster movies. Unfortunately though, the art of building tension in horror seems to have been forgotten. Now, the art of cheap scares that seek minimal thrills from an audience have taken the forefront of the genre. This is a flawed philosophy of filmmaking, and Chris Stuckmann makes an interesting, though possibly vulgar, analogy when he compares horror movies to sex. I know what you're thinking, this might seem strange, but what Chris has to say is that horror movies should be like sex. You don't want the audience to blow their load too early. Yes, it is a bit crass, but it makes sense in the context that there needs to be a build-up in order for your climax to be substantial or meaningful. Otherwise, the biggest scene will come across as tiresome and boring for your audience. Creating a strong narrative structure and editing it in a cohesive and clear linear or non-linear storyline is key to creating a successful horror film, and that is something that Universal did well in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Keeping all of these points in mind, I'm led to the big question: why do we watch horror when it's intended to horrify us? Personally, I lean towards horror because it develops a narrative form that allows for pure creativity and expression. However, that's not something that rings true for everybody. In order to understand a wider range of responses, I interviewed a few filmmakers and writers I know to see what they had to say on the subject.
I think that we like the rush. There's a lot of things that don't really surprise us anymore. We've been desensitized to a lot of stuff, and I think that horror films are kind of the one way that we can sort of get that jolt that really makes us feel something.
I would say that it has to do with experiencing the thrill of horror, because it's something that we don't really get to experience in everyday life, and that thrill is a part of life that a lot of other animals experience every day that we do not, that our ancestors did absolutely.
Well, I think we as people are attracted to the question of what if, but when you're watching a horror movie, it's not directly threatening you. So you're able to answer that what if question without actually being involved in the equation.
After hearing what they all had to say, it brought up the idea that maybe the reason horror sticks with us so well is that we desperately need to vent our dark creativity through something. The idea of horror answering the what if question is always intriguing, because such a general question can be brought down to many specific scenarios that aren't exactly socially acceptable. Stephen King brings up an interesting idea when he says, "I think that we're all mentally ill. Those of us outside the asylums only hide it a little better." Though this could be an exaggeration, it touches on the spine of each film made by Universal in the 3 decades, that humanity can be monstrous, and in every monster, there can be humanity. All 3 films depict men who morph into these monstrous forms that terrorize their towns, and yet in the end, all 3 films also show these monsters as men who were guided and blinded by love, lust, or greed, which are basic human emotions. Watching their descent into hell also almost lifts us up, and allows us to feel better about ourselves as viewers. King also comments on what he believes is the reason we engage with horror to begin with, saying that watching a horror is like lifting a trap door in the civilized forebrain and throwing a basket of raw meat to the hungry alligators swimming around in that subterranean river beneath. Why bother? To keep them down there. Suggesting that we have a deeply rooted and animalistic view of others' misfortune begs the question, are we only watching for the pleasure of seeing someone else's pain? Could this be the same reason why we enjoy things such as Grand Theft Auto or violent video games of the same nature? I'd like to think that audiences are better than that, and enjoy the films not only for their narrative structure, but for their technical advancement and their plotline. However, the influence of sadism in horror is something that is without a doubt notable. Overall, Universal Studios was aware of what audiences needed in the decades connected to the 3 films mentioned, and executed on reaching viewers on an emotional level. Whether it be the sadism and ideal of schadenfreude that guides viewers to simply enjoy the film, or a further appreciation for the technical accomplishments and narrative structure of the story, horror is a genre that audiences will connect with for years to come. Let's just hope that Hollywood chooses to draw inspiration from these classic Universal films rather than the films of today.